Good evening, everybody. Everybody outside, please come in if you can hear me. We have people in the foyer. I want to get ready and get started tonight. Or maybe they stay. Oh, we'll see. Books are later. All right, let's get started here. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back. Evenings at Whitney. We are excited to see you in person, but also hello and welcome to the people on Zoom. So we have two audiences tonight. My name is Sandra Lösken. I'm a faculty here, Associate Professor of Chemistry at UF at the Whitney Lab. And I'm very excited tonight to introduce a fellow drug discovery expert and a fellow researcher that I've been admiring for a long time. I think we are here for a treat tonight. A little bit of background, maybe for the people at Zoom that might not know about the Whitney Lab. So the Whitney Lab for Marine Bioscience is the biomedical marine research institute of the University of Florida. It is composed of currently 11 faculty-led laboratories that use marine organisms for basic biological research that can be applied to human health. We also try to understand local natural resources and definitely want to gain insights into our dynamic local environment here in Northern Florida. Whitney Laboratory provides training for future experimental biologists. As you see, we have lots of programs, educational programs from kindergartners to university level. We also have monthly lectures like this one that's coming back in person to reach out to the local community and engage them in our interest of research, but also in preserving this beautiful landscape we are in. As some of you might know, the Whitney Lab also features a sea turtle hospital, which promotes learning and awareness of the ocean and the sea turtles by doing rehabilitation, research, and education. So if you haven't seen our programs online, check them out, from education to environment to the sea turtles. So today, again, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cassandra Quave. Dr. Quave leads anti-infective drug discovery research initiatives and teaches classes on medicinal plants, food and health at Emory University, close to us in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Quave is a fellow of the Explorers Club and a former president of the Society of Economic Botany and a recipient of the Emory Williams Teaching Award. She is a co-creator of a very popular podcast called Foodie Pharmacology. Can highly recommend the podcast. And she is connecting basic science, applied science, with a lot of education and promoting in our communities. Here we are, sorry. She's a leader in the field of medical botany, ethnopharmacology, and she's authored over 100 research articles in her field. Very impressive. Besides that, she's also known for her work published in the New York Times Magazine, BBC Focus, and her work has been featured at PBS, NPR, and National Geographic Channel. So it's really, really a treat for us to have her here tonight. She is also the author of an acclaimed new book, which is called The Plant Hunter, a scientist's quest for nature's next medicine. And after the lecture, you will have a chance to check out the book outside. We can sign and sell books here tonight. I have it and I have read it, and it's quite a good book, so highly recommend it. With that, stage is yours, Kathy. Come on up.
maybe? Yes, yes. Okay, sorry for the small delay. Thank you so much, Dr. Lojan, for the beautiful introduction. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to see a pretty full audience considering Omicron. I really appreciate you being here. It's really nice to be able to speak to a room. And also hello to everyone that's on Zoom. Thank you also for tuning in tonight. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak with all of you today. And so today I'll be speaking about my new book. It is called The Plant Hunter, a scientist's quest for nature's next medicines. You can follow me on social media if you engage in Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. All those links are there for you. And so for the presentation, what I've decided to do is kind of walk you through a bit of my journey. This is not a scientific textbook. It is a memoir. So it is really a story of my journey of becoming a scientist, and in particular, a scientist who's really incredibly privileged to be able to travel the world and work with different peoples in different cultures to better understand the ways that they use plants as medicine, and then to also take those medicines the full circle back into modern science to really try and tease those plants apart, to understand how they might actually be useful for the broader scope of medicine around the globe. The book itself is broken into 3 units. I start off with a discussion of nature and really my origins. I'm actually a native Floridian, born and raised in Southwest Florida in a little town called Arcadia. It's a cow town, lots of cattle, orange groves, some tomatoes and watermelons, and that's about it. So, a really beautiful place to grow up along the Peace River. Who here has been to the Peace River? Anyone been there looking for fossils before? Just a gorgeous place to go canoeing if you have a chance to pass that part of the state. So I'll also take you through some of my early field experience in the Amazon, and then talk about how my own personal journey and experiences with infection have also shaped the types of research questions that I continue to ask today. And lastly, I'll wrap up with a bit of an overview on the third part of the book, where we really get into this broader global approach to ethnobotanical research. And ethnobotany is really a field that is multidisciplinary. So it requires team members with expertise in anthropology, in botany, chemistry, linguistics, anthropology, all of those kind of wrapped together to really get a better appreciation for what these medicines can do for our future. And so let's begin with nature, and starting with origins, I'll start with my origins. So these are my parents. This is my dad and my mom. My parents were both raised in Florida, and I was a bit of a surprise. So not a surprise, they knew that I was obviously coming, but this was in the 1970s before you had frequent ultrasounds to check the progression of pregnancy. And the surprise was that when I was born, they found that I was actually born missing a number of bones. So I had lower parts of my right leg were missing. My fibula, which is that bone where your calf muscle is, was completely missing on the right side. And I had a shortened femur and other missing bones in my foot. And so they didn't know quite what that meant on the broader scale. The doctors told them at my time of birth that I might never walk, and that I had a very real risk of being seriously also having other mental and developmental defects as well. And so it was a tough start for me. This is a picture of, I was sponsored by the March of Dimes. I'd been to hospitals all around the state of Florida as doctors conferred, trying to understand what was the best way to treat this congenital defect. And you can see the difference in the limb disparity just by looking at this block here. It was a pretty serious difference in limb length in addition to the missing bones. So I'm going to come back to that story in a bit. Just note that I had 1 to 2 surgeries a year from basically the age of 3 until I became an adult because of those deformities. But that didn't stop me. Growing up in Florida, I had exposure to an immense diversity of different things to explore in nature. And even the ditch in front of our house was a source of fascination for me. So it's really perfect being here at a marine and kind of water research station that I started off my scientific career in elementary school looking at microbial life in water. And this is with one of our dogs. I basically went on my crutches to the ditch and brought this back to the kitchen. And my mom's a school teacher, and she brought home a microscope for me to look through. And for me at that moment, growing up as a disabled child with limited mobility and limited, ways of really engaging in sports and other activities like other kids did, this was a way really that opened up a whole new world to me. And so looking through that microscope that day and drawing all those little structures and all those little creatures that I saw swimming around in the water really opened up a passion for really thinking about the world unseen. Because here was something that I looked at every day, but yet hidden within it had this miraculous diversity of life. And this was also the first time that I really had an awakening of my competitive spirit, because I competed in my first science fair. Now, how many of you love the science fair? A couple of people, yeah, okay, this is a good audience, right? I mean, I loved the science fair. It was my sport. It was what I excelled at. A lot of parents today, if you ask them if they love the science fair, they're like, oh no, because usually kids wait until the last minute and then it's a big stressful thing the night before everything is due. But it doesn't have to be that way. For me, the science fair was really something that was exciting and opened up not only experiences within my own school, but led me to travel around the state of Florida in the state science fairs and then later in international science fairs. And so in the book, I talk about this time of kind of scientific awakening, of really exploring and seeing and experiencing all of that hidden life. Now, when I went on to high school, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the town of Arcadia, where we're very heavily into beef cattle industry. My father is in the business of land clearing, which is ironic because I'm in the business of trying to conserve the forest today, and he mows it down for agricultural development. There's a good happy medium. I think you can meet in the middle. But I was really interested in this problem that came up in the 1980s, where we started to see more and more cases in the news of children and adults that were falling very ill due to eating undercooked hamburger meat. Does anybody remember the Jack in the Box stories and these times when you could have a family go through the drive-through and a kid, they all get kind of food poisoning, but then the youngest of the group dies because of kidney failure because of these really seriously virulent strains of E. coli that were being found in the beef. And so again, at an early age, I started thinking, well, how is that possible? Where can we find, the sources of contamination and who produces the cleanest beef? So I started off really comparing different samples of beef from different providers around town, the local markets, the Winn-Dixie, the Publix, and the local butcher. And the local butcher, of course, had the cleanest meat out of all of those. But it kind of helped, again, shift that direction away from microbes in the water to microbes and how they impacted human health. And so I continued working on E. coli for a number of years, and being from a small town and being kind of this weird kid that was really into science, I got to know the people that worked in the hospital clinical microbiology labs, and they gave me a space and let me play with my bacteria in the labs. And I really started to do more and more research, trying to understand also these patterns of drug resistance. We know today that antimicrobial resistance is probably the crisis of our medical future. It's hard to see that right now, especially when we're in the midst of COVID. But the reality is that by mid-century, it's estimated that we're going to lose 10 million people per year due to untreatable antimicrobial resistant infections. And if you put that into perspective with COVID, in the first year of COVID, which was horrific, we lost 2 million across the globe due to the disease. We're talking about 5 times the number of deaths by mid-century, because we simply don't have ways to address this problem of resistance. And so, as strange as it seems, I was fascinated with the ability of bacteria to really evolve and develop resistance starting in these early times. Now, how do you take science nerdy kid who's studying bacteria in a lab and bringing her all the way to this field of ethnobotany. That was a bit of a leap, right? I went to Emory actually for college with the intent of becoming a physician because I wanted to emulate all of the doctors that had treated me over many years. But while I was in college, I discovered the field of anthropology. I'd never been exposed to that before. And this idea around, the ways that different cultures or your cultural experience can shape your engagement with the natural world really started to fascinate me. And it was in my junior year that I first took this course in tropical ecology, where I read this book called Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice by Mark Plotkin. Has anyone ever read that book? Maybe one person. This is a book, it's a story about a Harvard-trained scientist who went to the Amazon and trained with a healer. And after reading that and learning more about these dynamics of medical anthropology and the importance of plants in medicine, I said, well, I have to go to the Amazon, as one does. And so I did. And this is when I started to really learn about the science of ethnobotany, which can also be defined as the science of survival. Because basically, this is the field that's dedicated to the documentation of human knowledge of how we persist in different environments. We all benefit from that knowledge. If you're wearing cotton clothing, that's thanks to someone that long ago sorted out that you could make fibers and cloth out of that cotton, right? And so we all stand on the benefit of this type of knowledge. And so picture this for a moment. I'm 21 years old. And I'm a rising senior in college, still very much on the pre-medical track, but just fascinated, driven by this question I had, this desire to understand the importance of this type of knowledge and how people survive that brings me to the Amazon. And from a kind of funny side note, I had just turned 21 and I went to the local hair shop at the university. I said, I need something light because I'm going to be in the jungle. She gave me a buzz cut. I had hair down to my waist, not what I was looking for. So I was a bit traumatized from that, but actually it turned to be very, very helpful when I was working in the jungle. So this is probably one of the most influential teachers that I've ever had the privilege to work with. He didn't have a classic education. He never went to school. He learned about healing from his grandfather, who, by the way, left him in the forest for weeks with nothing but some dried fish and a warning to stay put. If he ran back to the village, he would be beaten. He was told to tap into the sap of this tree and use that as a form of sustenance along with the fish and to get to know the forest. He was, I think, 8 or 9 at the time. That's quite an induction into what it means to be a healer. And this was his reality. When I met Don Antonio, he was working as a garden caretaker at a experimental field station and tourist lodge based in the Peruvian Amazon on the Napo River. That's not far from the Ecuadorian border. But he's so much more than this garden caretaker because he was a healer, a shamanic healer that uses the resources from the forest to treat his patients in the surrounding area, but also uses entheogens. These are hallucinogenic plants that have spiritual kind of connotations in his healing process. And the one that he used in particular was a plant combination known as ayahuasca. So working with Don Antonio, I started to learn more about how he used plants for healing, which plants he used for healing, and going much further beyond that, because it wasn't just simple pharmacy and surgery. That's what I had always seen medicine as being. But for him, it was more about the spirituality of the relationships between people, the relationships that people held with the forest, and also the relationships that those plants had with those people, because he believed that he could actually speak to the plants. He believed that they would teach him how to treat and even how to diagnose different ailments. And so as someone who was being classically trained as very hardcore kind of organic chemistry, human physiology, the physics, all of these kind of hardcore science classes, being exposed to this, it was quite an enlightening moment for me. At the same time, this is the first trip I worked with Don Antonio for 6 weeks, and I came back over the winter break for another 6 weeks to continue both my work with him, but also to investigate this other issue that began to make me curious. So I think one of the greatest skills that a scientist can have is to be a careful observer, right? A careful observer of phenomena. And one of the phenomena that I noticed while I was working in the Amazon, speaking with different mothers in the region, is that their children carried very, very high intestinal parasite loads. These kids were anemic, they had frequent respiratory disease, and they were also more susceptible to malaria, which is endemic in the region. Anyone ever had worms before? I had them as a kid because I ran barefoot everywhere in Florida around cow pastures. Worms can come, these intestinal parasites can enter through your skin. They can also enter by drinking raw river water, right? And so these kids are constantly drinking water straight from the river, even though there have been a lot of educational campaigns with the local schools and with families teach them to boil the water. So they just have this incredibly high parasite load. But what I saw as being really interesting, the point that really got me, I think, to think deeper about the importance of ethnobotanical knowledge was at the same time in each of these villages, there was a tree that Don Antonio and other healers used to regularly deworm and treat this kind of parasite load in kids. The problem is that the people in these villages, which had been more westernized, they were no longer had an indigenous identity, no longer knew how to use those trees. They no longer understood the dosing or how to use it safely because it could have pretty serious side effects if you use the wrong dose, depending on the health and weight of the child. And so this was just a maddening kind of dilemma for me, because imagine you have all these sick kids and the solution is right there, but because of this divide that's been driven by introduction of Western medical concepts into a community, they no longer had that connection to the traditional knowledge of how to use their own resources. Now, of course, had the Western medical paradigm been effective in the sense of having access to medication, it would have been a different story. But here's the problem. These communities had been introduced to Western medicine with very low starting supplies. And because they don't engage in a cash economy, they didn't buy resupplies. So they didn't have simple pills like mebendazole to help deworm the kids. And they had no medicines. And so in the end, they were left with nothing. And that really hit me as something very poignant and very, very much of a big lesson, and really helped me to make that decision to change the direction of my own career. And so upon my return to Atlanta, when I got accepted to medical school, I decided not to go. And I called my parents and said, I'm going to become an ethnobotanist. And they said, an ethno what? What does that mean? And I said, don't worry, it's all going to work out. So let's go back to the importance of medicinal plants and ethnobotany. So I've already discussed that ethnobotany is a scientific study of how people survive in different environments, how they use that knowledge to come up with resources for their clothing, for their food, for their medicine, for their hunting implements, for their fishing implements, for their housing, all of those different tools. When it comes to medicine, which is the area that I continue to focus in today, it's really important to note that not only have medicinal plants helped to form a large portion of our modern day medical pharmacopoeia, but medicinal plants are also used heavily by billions of people around the globe. In fact, in many developing countries, it's estimated that between 70 and 95% of all people in those countries rely on plants as their major form of medicine. When they have a headache or a stomach ache or a cut or a wound or an infection, they don't go to the pharmacy. They go to the resources they've collected from the wild and use those as medicines. And what is alarming is not only are we losing the knowledge of some of these therapies, but we're also losing the habitats where these plants can be found due to climate change and also due to expansion of human populations into different environments and overharvesting. Now, here's something that I think really hit me early on in my training as being really, really important and amazing. If you think about all the diversity of plant life on Earth, There are an estimated 374,000 to maybe 390,000 species of different plant species that we have on Earth. What's amazing is that across all these different cultures and communities and languages, humankind has sorted out medicinal uses of 9% of all plant life. 33,000 species have documented as being used in medicine. 33,000. When you think about the fact that we only use a few species in our food system, that's pretty amazing in our modern food system. What is shocking though, and this is kind of one of the big motivations behind writing this book, was it's really also a call to arms. Because from a scientific perspective, we've barely looked at a few hundred of those species with any level of rigor. There is so much out there to study, and there aren't enough people trained to study it. We have to change that. Why is it so important to study these? And this is a slide I like to remind people about, because often when we go to the pharmacy, and I'm even talking about over-the-counter medicines, if you've ever had to get a stimulant laxative, most of those are made out of plant-derived compounds. If you have medication for pain, many of our major pain medications come from plant-derived compounds. If you've been unfortunate enough to have cancer, many of our leading cancer therapies were originally discovered in plants. So they have these long and fancy names, and they come in a pharmaceutical bottle, and many people miss the point, including our healthcare providers of today, because they're not taught about the origins of our medicines. Many of these were in fact discovered in plants and have since been slightly modified or derivatized by synthetic chemists to make them into pharmaceutical pills. But the inspiration, and in some cases, the exact structure of these compounds was originally discovered in plants, and in many cases from plants that have been used already in different systems of medicine for a similar indication. And these are just a few examples. So you don't have to be an organic chemist to appreciate the diversity of structures and the complexity of how these molecules come together. These are, I would say, impossible for a synthetic chemist to just dream up of in the lab. We need starting blueprints for them to play with. And this is where this kind of work can be really, really important. Now, when it comes to some of the challenges, I was one of 210 researchers from around the globe that compiled the most recent report by Kew Royal Botanic Garden on the state of the world's plants and fungi. And things don't look good right now. 2 in 5 plants are threatened with extinction. We are losing these habitats faster than we can even begin to try and save them. And again, we're also losing opportunities to study many of these species. And we may never get the opportunity to study many of these before they're gone forever. Okay, so that's nature. Let's move on to infection. And for anyone that has a bit of a weak stomach, I do talk about infection in the book. Hopefully it's not too graphic, but there are some scenes where I told the whole story of what it's like to deal with these kinds of infections. So this is me at 3, after my first surgery. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, I was born with multiple congenital deformities, and at the age of 3, they decided that the best path forward to allow me to walk would be to amputate my leg below the knee. Unfortunately, when I was sent home, my mother started to smell something really bad. It smelled cloyingly sweet. I wasn't in pain, but she knew something was wrong, and she unraveled that bandage, and she saw jutting bone hanging out. The flesh was falling out of the wound bed. I had a double infection of staph and gangrene, and I had to be rushed back to the hospital, where I spent months in therapy, antibiotic therapy, and also betadine baths. Everyone know what betadine looks like? Imagine being a kid being put into a tub of that and it's all jet and bubbling. I thought it was like a vat of blood they were putting me in. But fortunately, this was the 1980s. And this is before we had such super horrifically resistant and aggressive strains of staph that we do today. Had this happened to me today, I don't know if the outcome would have been the same. I don't know if my recovery would have been the same. But as a result of this, I have some long-lasting consequences because I lost so much of the tissue. I was just barely able to keep my knee, and I only have a little bit of scar tissue under my stump's bone. So I'm not able to handle the pressure like some of these Olympic athletes, Paralympic athletes that have the super bouncy legs can run and bounce on. I can't do that. Also, those legs cost like what a new car costs to get, but I can't do that. Okay. I mentioned earlier some of the dangers that we're facing when it comes to antimicrobial resistance. Around estimates today are around 700 to 800,000 deaths per year. They're thinking closer to 10 million per year by 2050. And I'm a big fan of history and trying to really understand the long-term history of medicine. And when you think about human medicine from that perspective and that scale, when you kind of zoom out, it's important to realize that we've only had antibiotics as we know them today for less than a century, and we're already losing much of their activity because of the rise of resistance. Now, don't get me wrong, antibiotics were the game changer when it came to the capacities that we now benefit from in modern medicine. They are what enabled childbirth to be safer, what can't make cancer therapy possible, make your minor scrapes and wounds treatable so that you don't die from a scratch in the garden, because that's what happened before the antibiotic era for some people. And so we have, again, a major thing to work on. And here's where it gets even trickier. In addition to having the scientific crisis of the fact that we're running low on not only drugs that work, for those scientists that are able to bring new drugs to the market, the economic model is consistently failing. There are examples in the past few years where companies have brought a new drug to market, had it FDA approved, and the company went bankrupt right after approval. The reason that happens is because the ways that we will try to conserve some of these resources to treat patients that have the more serious, more resistant infections. So we don't want to use those brand new drugs right away. But also the challenge there is that this is a resource that is going to pretty quickly lose activity because of resistance. And so much of the modern pharmaceutical industry has exited the antibiotics research and development field. So could plants be the solution? I think so. I think they could be a big part of the solution by helping us to think about new ways to innovate how we deal with infections. I've worked with healers from all over the world, and I can say that there's one thing that they share in common, despite vast differences in language and the types of species they have access to and use. And that similarity is their heavy focus on this idea of homeostasis. When they treat a patient, it is not about killing a pathogen. It's about restoring balance in the whole patient. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that kind of practice, not only by observing the way that that medicine is practiced, but also observing the mechanisms by which these different pharmacological agents act. And in this case, those pharmacological agents are coming in the form of extractions of plants. So let's talk about medicine. This is an overall schema of how one can go from traditional knowledge of a medicinal plant all the way down that drug discovery, drug research and development pipeline. And so on the left side, we can see that we start with ethnobotanical information. And here I'm reducing it to a single block. It's important to note that when we're working with different healers in different communities, we have international collaborative research agreements. We have agreements with the communities. We have intense levels and layers of ethics and access and benefit sharing agreements to ensure that this kind of work is not exploitive, but instead is a giving and sharing where both parties would benefit. Because unfortunately, the history of this kind of engaging with knowledge has not always worked out to the benefit of local people. So we want to be very careful in that. So we both interview people in person today, but we also look to historic records. I was just working on a grant today for a collaboration that I'm trying to get started in Egypt, where we're going to be looking at a number of plants in this oasis west of Cairo. And you know, what's amazing about the history of Egyptian medicine, it has one of our earliest records of plant-based medicine. It goes back to 1500 BCE or BCE, so that's around 3,000 years ago. And yet, even those plants that we've written about and known about for 3,000 years haven't been studied for the most part. So there's a lot for us to do. So we go out into nature, we collect those plants, we prepare the extracts, and then we undertake different biological assays in laboratories. So we take those chemicals from each plant tissue and test it against different microbiological targets, but we also test them against human cells to ensure they're safe for human cell exposure. There are lots of things in nature that can kill bacteria and deactivate viruses, but guess what? They can also kill you. Not everything in nature is safe, and we have to be very careful in understanding that aspect of the pharmacology. We then go through a lot of heavy chemistry because, again, a single leaf may have hundreds of distinct compounds. And here's the other thing that makes things even more difficult. Nature doesn't work often in this single compound, single target way. Nature often works by combinations of molecules that it produces to achieve its final desired effect. Modern medicine, on the other hand, works by single compound to single target because we live today in a very reductionist time of science, because dealing with complexity is very difficult. So we're trying to push the envelope a bit on that, but we're not there yet. So we do isolate compounds to try and understand which ones are playing a role, but we're trying to start to look more and more at these combination of compounds because that really is the way that nature works. And I think that is also a big part or a big piece of the puzzle of how we're going to eventually overcome resistance. We know that combination therapies work from other approaches in medicine. If you think about HIV cocktails, if you think about cancer therapy cocktails, we know that cocktail-based therapies work. But again, nature naturally has its own cocktails that it's using to defend itself from different pathogens, and we can learn from that. And so again, working with different communities, in addition to ensuring that we have ethical paradigms for the ways that we engage with people, in this phase of my career, I'm also trying to put more and more effort into what we call research capacity building. If you look at a map of the world, here you can see in darker brown, these are what are known as the 36 terrestrial biodiversity hotspots across the globe. These are places in the world that must have at least 1,500 endemic species. So these are species that are only found in that part of the world. And they also must have at least 70% of their native vegetation either threatened or they've already lost that vegetation. And so these are places that we like to work. And guess what? These are also places that are really, really good spots to look for new plants and new chemistries that could have medicinal potential. The challenge, of course, is that in many of these locations, local scientists have very, very poor infrastructures in which to work. They don't have the equipment access. They don't always have the access to training. So we've put a lot of work in recent years to helping to build up this idea of global collaborations and also working collaboratively to go after different funding mechanisms, including, for example, from the US State Department in the Balkans. We've been successful in getting State Department funding to help their biology department build up and purchase new equipment. And we've helped train their scientists and set up new labs. And I really think this is a big part of the future. You can't do all this work on your own. Even among all the best American scientists, we cannot do it on our own, nor should we do it on our own. This needs to be a global effort. And I think we can do a lot more by helping our neighbors across the globe. The areas in yellow are all areas where we have active collaborations. You can tell I've done a lot of work in the Mediterranean basin, but we've also got collaborations in places like South Africa and in Uganda, where one of my former students is actually working on a field known as zoopharmacognosy. Has anyone ever heard that before? This is how animals use plants as medicine. So he follows primates in the field, these great apes, and watches how they use different plants as medicine. But guess what? There are other scientists that have shown that even butterflies use plants as medicine. So it's not just about humans using these resources. There are lots of other areas that we can look for solutions as well. A bit of the journey through some of the different field sites that I talk about in the book. I'll just go over some of these briefly to give you some different examples. This is after my work in the Amazon, I went to work in southern Italy with an ethnic minority group. This is before I started graduate school, is when I first went, and I came back later. But this particular group are descended from Albanians that fled the Ottoman Empire when it was invading the Balkans 5 centuries ago. And so they speak an endangered language. Languages are also disappearing across the globe. And each time a language disappears, it's like a library of knowledge disappears with it as well. And so understanding and really working with different communities that have these languages that are trying to conserve both the languages and the knowledge embedded within that language is really important. And so this is a community of Ginestra, also known as Jura in Arbresh. And this is one of my earlier research partners, Professor Andrea Pironi. At the time, I was not even a grad student yet. I was fresh out of college, and he was a postdoc based in London. He's now the editor of one of the leading journals in our field, the Journal of Ethnobiology and Ethnomedicine, and is the former director of the University of Slow Food. If you've heard of the slow food movement, he's heavily involved in that. And in fact, we were working together in Italy looking at food, and in particular, wild foods, and trying to understand how people with this dying language recognized wild ingredients and used them as foods. And guess what? This is another hidden element to the Mediterranean diet. It's not just about eating fish and olive oil and red wine. It's all these wild, bitter greens that are incredibly rich in antioxidant-bearing compounds that we studied there. While I was there, I also met a number of healers. This is Zia Elena, and you can tell from her smile, I hope, just the kind of spirit and heart that she had. She was in her 90s when I met her, and she was what we call one of the women who help, quelli che aiutano in Italian. And so people would come from all around, much like Don Antonio served people in the Amazon, she served people in these communities, but not always with plants. She was engaged in more spiritual healing that would use plants almost as more a symbolic agent. And so she would pray over them, use these plant-based rituals. And a lot of the things that she studied, or that she treated actually, had to do with inflammatory skin diseases. And this is important because later I ended up studying these inflammatory skin diseases to better understand the role of these plants in this. And while I was in Italy, life happened. I met a really wonderful guy in that very tiny village that I happened to be in, and we got married and had kids. And I went back there for graduate school where I continued in my work. And this is a picture with my youngest when I was a graduate student working in the community. And so in the book, in this third section, I also talk about some of the very real challenges of what it's like to juggle a career and really trying to get off the ground with a career, because in science, the unfortunate reality is that you are very underfunded, very poor for a very long time before you can ever actually start making a regular income. I think even with a premier NIH stipend that I had during that time, I think my salary was $18,000 or $19,000 a year to live in Miami. So we ate a lot of beans and rice during those years. So there's a level of personal sacrifice. So I think today things have improved a lot. I know that my students make a living wage now, but it hasn't always been like that. And there have been challenges again in finding that balance. But there have also been great moments of joy. And some of the things that I really have loved about this opportunity to do the kind of work that I do is that I've been able to bring my children with me on many of these field expeditions. And so this is just an image of us coming off of a mountain with our team of donkeys after getting up very early and collecting plants. And that's one of my graduate students who's now graduated. He got to walk. He didn't get a donkey. He was strong. But this exposure, I think, to different cultures has been really, really incredible for them. I've also really benefited from many great collaborations and working in different field sites. Here's some examples of our work in longleaf pine habitats. Just to the north of here, this is in southwest Georgia in Baker County, where we've done a lot of work also with our students at the Jones Ecological Research Station, or the Jones Center at Itchaway. This is a unique habitat, 30,000 acres of intact longleaf pine, which you don't find much of anymore in the Southeast. This was basically the bird hunting grounds of Robert Woodruff, the old president and CEO of Coca-Cola. And he left this in trust. He didn't have children. He left this in trust to be used for research and environmental education into perpetuity. So we've been really lucky to be able to work in this site as well. I've done a lot of work, as I mentioned, in the Balkans, continuing in this journey with Professor Pironi, now years later, where we've really tried to follow and trace that lineage of these ethnic Albanians that immigrated into Italy, trying to understand how those changes over time in their knowledge of plants in Italy, how those compare to current day Albanian practices with these plants. And I think one of the really great things about my job too is I get to speak with really interesting people. When it's in a country where I'm fluent in the language, I like to conduct all the interviews myself. But the reality too is when I'm working in places like in Albania or in Kosovo, we have to have an interpreter because in 1 week I may be interviewing someone in Serbian, Guarani, and Albanian. And I know just enough Albanian to get me into trouble. I can get enough to like fool somebody thinking I speak Albanian and they start speaking really fast. I'm like, no, I don't understand anything you said. So having this, again, teamwork effect is really important. And so working with my students, these are some of my students working in South Florida and DeSoto County, my home county, working with ranchers, local large landholders that allowed us to have access to their land to go out and collect plants. And here were some of my research partners, again, with a diversity of training. So this is Professor Alfonso La Rosa. He's a naturalist. He's basically a walking encyclopedia of species in the Sicilian Islands. He can name every plant we come up to with its full detail. It's incredible. And Professor Alessandro Saita is also at the University of Palermo, and his work is really on fungi. So it's great to bring in someone that understands other types of remedies from that angle as well. On my most recent expedition, which was in 2019, I was in the Heiser Mountains of Albania and Kosovo, kind of crossing back and forth across the border with the National Geographic team. And this was probably one of the most beautiful wildflower meadows I'd ever been in, but I just kept sneezing the entire time because I have horrible seasonal allergies. So you have these gorgeous places, but sometimes you have to also come very prepared to deal with some of the other challenges. And of course, the elephant in the room is how does someone like me, who can barely walk, who was told I wouldn't be able to walk as a kid, get out and do this? It comes with a lot of careful planning, whether it's getting an airboat or a team of donkeys, or just taking my sweet time as I have to walk up those mountains and having research collaborators that are understanding of that and can help with that. And there's, again, just a lot of joy, and I hope that comes across in the book as well, is the joy of discovery, because that's really what this journey is all about. It's about discovery, it's about sharing, it's about empowering people and their cultures. And this is just another funny reality. Instagram, my day starts like this, but this is the reality by the end of the day. One of my friends took this picture that was on the field expedition. She says, you have to show this. I'm like, no, I look awful. She's like, that's the point. People need to see the reality of how exhausting it can be to do this kind of work, but we do it with a lot of pleasure at the same time. And so what we do in total is we take field research, we deposit these specimens in the herbarium, which is like a plant museum. These specimens, by the way, can last 500 or 600 years. And so I always tell my students to take care as they make these specimens, because they may actually inform scientists, half a millennium away from now. We have the chemistry lab where we examine the chemistry of these plants, and the microbiology lab where we investigate their activity against these different targets. So in all, we have over 650 different species in the lab. We have around 2,000 different extracts. And what this has allowed us to do is build up a really unique resource, because we have a one-of-a-kind resource now that's based on plants that are used in different cultures for infectious and inflammatory disease. And we've been very successful in using this resource to look for new types of antibiotics, but also we've been putting this towards our work on COVID and our work on antifungals and our work on cancer and our work on discovering new molecules that could be medically relevant. And so this is a long build, but I'm hoping you can see, starting from that time as a little girl, looking at those drops of water and being fascinated, with all of those different creatures swimming around, how this has all come together. And again, a lot of this is about bringing people together, training the next generation of scientists, and also really working to build up the knowledge, bringing it back to these communities so that they can use it in their own way, in their own ways that they wish to use it. Let's see, a couple of examples, and I'm going to wrap up just to give you some examples of the work that we've done. We've done a lot of work in understanding how different traditional remedies work, and even among those remedies that scientists have looked at, but perhaps missed a couple of key elements because the indigenous use of those plants wasn't always taken into account. For example, we know that today, if you've ever looked at ginkgo supplements, we often use the leaves of ginkgo as a supplement for brain health and memory. But historically, in traditional Chinese medicine, it was the seed coats that were used to treat skin infections. We showed how that works in treating skin infections. We've done a lot of work on St. John's wort, again, used today as a supplement. However, it also has known toxicities to the skin. So if you take this as a supplement or exposed to left sun, you can have a photoreaction. But when I was working in the Balkans with one of my dermatology residents, we noted that people were making this oil-based formula of St. John's wort and putting it on their skin all the time and weren't suffering from these kind of phototoxic reactions. So we brought the actual formulas that people use in the field back to the lab. And what we discovered is that the way that they prepare the remedy actually resulted in the eradication or removal of that toxic compound. So it's not just about which plants people are using. It's also very important to understand how they prepare those plants. The making of the medicine is as important as the ingredients of the medicine. We've done a lot of work on this plant. Anyone know this one? Flora, oh yeah. I bet you all hate this plant. Everyone in Florida hates this plant. I love it. You know why I love it? I love it because it has some amazing chemistry. I mean, what is a weed but a really successful plant? Okay, this would put that out there. And this plant's successful because it produces compounds that help it to defend itself against different types of pests and pathogens. And we found, going back into the texts of the 1600s in Latin, this was used historically to treat non-healing wounds and ulcers. And so using our tools in the lab, I know I'm almost out of time, I just wanted to highlight this. We made this out of Legos. This is a machine that would have cost 15 to 20 grand. We built it for $500 with hardware supplies and some Legos for my kid at home. That's kind of a funny side story. But we were using that Lego kit, we were able to discover some molecules that work very effectively in hitting that dreaded staph bacteria, particularly MRSA, MRSA. And we not only were able to get the structures in two-dimensional format, but also the crystal structures, which allow us to look at these compounds in three-dimensional space. We've done a lot of work on another plant. This is the last one I'll show you. Anyone know of this plant, American beautyberry? Maybe it's growing in your yard as a decoration. It's a beautiful plant. You can also eat the berries. You can make jellies out of it. But the native peoples of the Southeast US also use this for a variety of things, ranging from malaria to warding off insects and for different skin applications. We found a compound in this plant that actually works to restore the activity of certain classes of antibiotics, certain types of antibiotics that no longer work against bacteria like MRSA. And so again and again and again, we're finding these very interesting molecules. We're finding these very interesting explanations for how these work. But again, this wouldn't be possible without that traditional knowledge to lead us there. So it's not just about hammering away in the science lab. It's really, truly taking into consideration all of that knowledge around how things are prepared and how they are transformed into these medicines. And so I'll thank my team. This is an older picture pre-COVID. I need to get a new picture, but I think this one's fun because we have all of our masks off on this one. If you're looking for other resources, I also, as Dr. Lozgen mentioned, I have a podcast called Foodie Pharmacology. You can find on any of your podcast streaming services. I talk with farmers, I talk with chefs, I talk with Nobel Prize winning scientists, authors. So lots of different people. We're talking about that food medicine connection. And then I have a YouTube channel where we also post the video versions of that podcast. And I have lots of other free educational videos and lecture materials. I put some of my lectures I use in my classes up on that site for the general public. And lastly, I've got the book. I did fly down with a couple boxes. The bookstore wasn't able to come because of Omicron, but I was able to bring, I think, around 20 copies. So if anyone would like to purchase one tonight, they're $27 and I can take card. So or your Apple Pay. Okay, thank you all for your attention. I think we can take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Quave. That was amazing, as always. So very exciting. Other questions from the audience? Don't be shy. It's been too long, huh?
Oh, thanks. So how do you get the advances that you make in the science back to help the community that you got the basic information from? So how does that work?
That's a great question. So the first way that we start access and benefit sharing is really in making sure that the knowledge is being returned to healers. I'll give you the example of some of the work that one of my students did in Uganda, working with a group of indigenous healers. And he asked them, this is the key thing, you ask the people, the communities you're working with, what they want. So we're not force feeding them things that they don't want. And the healers across the board wanted to know how the medicines work, what we discovered in the lab. Could he come back and teach them what we learned to help them in their decision-making processes and how to use these plants? That's one way. Obviously, we've also done a lot of work in community outreach and programs. One of the things that we often do is we'll have a community celebration, like a workshop. People will come together, we'll have food, we'll have a party, we'll talk about the knowledge. We bring it back to the community, often in the form of booklets. We've also done, when we were able to get EU funding, we did a nice printed, but really nice glossy photo book that was written in 3 languages, in Italian, Arborish, and English, to be used in education, and then gave the PDF to the community so they can print those on demand as they wanted to make more copies. We've also been able to get some funding to build botanical gardens. Like when I say botanical garden, it's more of like a small community garden where we have labels of plants, and again, use as an educational resource for local healers to teach children about this. There are lots of other examples of other great programs like the Amazon Conservation Team, the Shaman's Apprentice Program. They provide ways to basically pay for people to go undergo training, because they can't just give up and have no source of income in today's economy. So there are lots of different ways this can be done. And lastly, we have agreements to come to agreements. So none of my discoveries have yet made it into the FDA clearance. I have one that's getting close, that's being pursued as a medicated manage to treat diabetic foot ulcers and non-healing wounds and kind of venous leg ulcers. And so if that makes it through and it starts to generate revenue, then funds from that will also be funneled back through the university, back to these communities as well. And so it really differs depending on the site and what they wish for, but in all cases, the idea is definitely start by returning the knowledge in the way that they ask, they want it to be returned in. It's a great question.
One question, yeah, right here.
Do you think you're really going to achieve the ability to potentiate the ability of an antibiotic to kill MRSA?
I mean,
how close are you there?
We've seen that definitely in lab studies. So here's the other challenge. If I were doing this, if I were designing an app or software, it's very, very easy to get funding from industry or from investors or angels and things to push that forward. The problem with drug development is it's a very long process, very expensive process. It costs around $1 billion to bring a new drug to market. And so it's not an easy return on investment for someone that wants to invest in a technology. And so as a result of that, things take a lot longer than I wish they did. Because basically at the stage for our work on the beta-lactam potentiator, we found the molecule. We've worked with a chemistry team at Notre Dame who has achieved full synthesis. So the chemist, again, took the blueprint. They were able to make that blueprint, and now we can make small changes to that blueprint. So we're trying to improve and improve and improve upon the compound. We have to now get it into animals and get it closer and closer to what's known as a preclinical package. But this is also as we get closer to what's called the valley of death. The valley of death is where all good drugs go to die. So there is a big chasm between your academic science research and what is going to be that kind of, jump beyond the canyon into something that goes into clinical trials. So it's not a simple process. We are pushing on it. We are writing lots of grants, trying to move this forward through federal funding. And it's important to note too, all of you in the room that pay your taxes, you are paying for this research. So I thank you. Because without that federal funding, none of this would be possible.
I have a Zoom question. Have you tapped into the data generated and maintained by the USDA's Agricultural Research Service Office of Economic Botany, formerly headed by Dr. James Duke?
Yes, so Dr. Duke was an amazing character. I actually met Dr. Duke in the Amazon, and he was barefoot and playing a guitar. That's a story from another day. He was a really cool guy. But Dr. Duke has this amazing resource where he basically had a database of different plants. That is a resource. We don't really use that as heavily. We are using more heavily the database that was created by Dr. Dan Moorman. It's known as the Native American ethnobotany database, because it's been especially relevant to our look for plants here in the Southeast US. And their historic uses that were documented. So these are both examples of databases that were based on scientific literature and also older texts of kind of, anthropological theses and dissertations going back even to the 20s and 1930s that documented the ways that different indigenous people across the US and in some cases beyond used plants as medicine. Those are useful. However, the challenge in using those types of resources is that there's often a lot of detail missing. So going again back to that idea of the St. John's wort, it's not just that plant X is good for this. You have to know what part of plant X, how is plant X prepared, when is it harvested, is it combined with something else? It's all those different layers that are really important. I think this is one of the key reasons why this kind of engagement with communities that are alive and using plants today is so important. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for houseplants?
You need to ask my husband because he's the one that keeps them alive in our house. I am really, really amazing at finding plants in the wild, chopping them apart, killing them and dragging them back to my lab to rip out their chemistry. But ask me to keep plants alive in the house is a bit of a challenge for me. I need to take some horticulture classes. Yes.
I guess I'm really not sure how to ask this question or formulate it in a way, so I'll bear with me for a second. But you mentioned about the relationship with the elders and how they grew up and learned to recognize the plant as almost family-like.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned about how they've taken the medicines and the process of creating the medicine is a part of it. But also you've touched on a little bit of it's the whole person they're healing, which is mind, body, spirit, emotion, not just whatever the disease is. And I've watched Western medicine do this on a lot of different scales, like yoga and Tai Chi and like all kinds of stuff they're up to doing, taking it and eliminating the stuff that they don't understand. So my question is you're learning all this, you're taking all this in the lab. It seems that there's a lot of elimination from what they were brought up with, because no, they didn't go to school, but they went to the best university in the world, which is out there in the middle of the woods at age 9, which I didn't start my schooling until way later, right? How is the value of that being brought into Western medicine? And most of the time the answer is it's not, but maybe I should ask, when is it time to bring that into consideration? Because it is.
I mean, I think the time was yesterday. I mean, especially one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the collective trauma that across the globe everyone's been facing with this ongoing pandemic. It's emotional, it's physical, I mean, people are in pain, our children are in pain. And I think there's never been a time where these concepts from traditional medicine could play a bigger role. the challenges in our current era of science, so you have all these phases, these kind of paradigm shifts that have happened over time. Think about, at one time, the idea that you could have tiny little animals or living things on your body was just absurd. They couldn't, that just didn't exist in the scope of human imagination for hundreds of years. And I think that we're kind of stuck right now in this very reductionist time of science. Now, reductionism can be beneficial. It can help us get at some certain answers, but we've got to move beyond that. And I'm not sure how that leap's going to be made. But I think that when it comes to the plant sciences, at least, I'm seeing glimmers of hope in our new advances in chemistry and our new advances in the ability to look at complex mixtures of molecules and to identify those and think about how they might be working together. But on the whole scale, yes, this has to be brought into practice, but what's the right way? And also the challenge, I think, especially around botanicals, is there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of instances of basically people are trying to make money, and it's not based on science and can sometimes even be very dangerous. And this is something I've tried to be more of an advocate for. For example, when the case of the deadly oleander plant was being pitched as a remedy and for COVID, and it happened to be the exact cardiac glycoside that is known to be deadly. My fear was that people were going to start self-medicating with this. And I took the stand and I wrote an opinion essay on this to make people aware. I got a lot of nasty comments from people from that. Not everyone wants to see the scientific truth. I think that scientists have to speak out, but it can be tricky. And so there's a fine line you have to walk. And I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. I'm trying, but yeah, it's challenging. Yeah, that's the goal. It's like, can you serve as this bridge? Yeah. Thank you.
Last question. So first
Okay.
off, we've had a lot of positive feedback from all of our online participants.
Thank you
So
all.
everyone wants to express how much they've enjoyed the lecture. As one last question for the evening, really relevant, what is a natural treatment that you believe is good against COVID? I've heard you mention that you guys were looking into it and ways to treat it.
Yeah, so I'm really trying not to put too much pressure on my very hardworking graduate student right now. I have a copy of her manuscript in my hands right now, and I need to finish revising it. It's looking really good. She looked at over around 2,000 extracts from our library, that great library that we've created. We found 2 that are safe in lab cell-based models and that work in live virus, again, in lab-based models. They've not been put into animals. And we hope to get this out into the public literature soon. I can't say much more about it at this time, because I want to make sure that the full data is gone through the process of peer review, because it's important for other scientists to check our work, to give their opinions on our work, to ensure that it's done in the most rigorous way. I think one of the challenges in this, again, is you don't want to put certain plants under threat, because these are plants that you can find, but you could make, remedies yourself. We don't know how they'll work in humans yet. And so I think you have to be really, we try to be really clear in our science communication about, just because something works in a petri dish doesn't always mean that it's going to work in the whole human. And I think that's really important. My hope is that it will, but until we do the studies, we won't know. So we are working on it, I promise, and it's going to be hopefully out very soon in the literature. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I'll be signing books if anyone wants one. We have some for sale on the table. Thank you.
If you want to support. Thank you, Cassie. That was great. So we're outside. If you want to support some really cool research, buy a book today, buy it online. And if you have questions, we're here. So talk to us. All right. Thank you, Cassie. It was awesome.